Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, January 30th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We got to start talking about that Michigan versus the NCAA. Michigan pushing back against the NCAA just a little bit, and I think it's a sign of what the NCAA is to a lot of teams out there right about now. Then we'll get to which head coach is going to win their first national title. A lot of guys definitely are in line to possibly get that next one, maybe even in 2025. But definitely want to join Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, and Dabo Swinney as the only active head coaches with a national title. Then we'll get to my favorite NFL prospects, kind of part two of this. I have a ton of different guys, and we'll talk about that guy we talked about yesterday, Alfred Collins from Texas. Very talented, very athletic. Then we'll get to my way too early 2025 superlatives. I'll go with best quarterback, best offensive, defensive player, sleeper, team of the year, all of that different stuff as I head into the 2025 season. Obviously can change once we're in there. And then we'll get to my top 10 head coaches as we head into 2025. Very tough list to put together. A ton of guys that are hanging right around that 9 to 13 area, but feel pretty good about the list that I've put together. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that, and we can have fun back and forth and ask any questions you have about possibly this Michigan saga, because it continues on. Michigan has decided to fight against the NCAA just a little bit. They released a 137-page document basically detailing why some of their level 1 violations should be dropped to a level 2 violation instead of a level 1, try to diminish some of the penalties that they could incur during this time. And it's a little bit of a complicated story, and definitely one that we'll have more details on as we go throughout this kind of saga that we're on right now. But at the end of the day, there's a couple of different things to think about here, and overall, let's just break down what the story is, what has been released and what was released yesterday that we didn't necessarily know, or at least didn't know in very certain terms. The biggest one is multiple staff members were warned about the wrongdoing. Multiple staff members had knowledge, at least, that there was something that went beyond the rules. One of the most best examples is Mike Hart, the former running back coach there, was informed that Michigan was, quote-unquote, going further in the sign-stealing process than others by a Rutgers staff member. So that was something that, people in that program had knowledge that, at the very least, other people felt that they were going further than other teams were. So that is obviously something that we knew to a certain extent. We had a knowledge that certain people within that program knew. We didn't know how far up it went. Seems like a lot of the position coaches, at the very least, knew what was going on, including Mike Hart. And then you had another person in the Michigan program, a much lower level person, raise the concern to a number of people because Connor Stalions asked him to go rent a car to go scout Georgia, which was a team they were going to play in the CFP. But technically, that is not against the rules of the NCAA because they weren't on their regular season schedule. So that's kind of the gray area that Michigan's working in here. They're saying, we did X, Y, and Z, but all of those things aren't necessarily against the NCAA investigation because we didn't play them in the regular season, or because it wasn't by a specific staff member, it was by a family member of a staff member. Some stuff like that has really popped up, and apparently the kid that inside the Michigan program that brought it up to Chris Partridge, was one of the one of the position coaches there for a time before he left last year. He told Stalions, told Stalions that you can't use him in your signal organization stupid thing, whatever that means. And it does show that, at the very least, there were people within that program that had very real working knowledge of what was going on. They fully understood that some of the stuff that he was doing went beyond what was allowed by the NCAA. What they're arguing is some semantic arguments, if I'm being totally honest. Some semantics that, it wasn't on a regular season schedule, or it wasn't a staff member doing it. It was a family member of a staff member. So it's a complicated issue, but the reality is we know for a fact now that a number of staff members knew, and a number of them go up to another guy, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The other part is the tip came from within the Michigan program. That is something that Everyone liked to tell you that it was Ryan Day's family, that it was Ryan Day's brother. It was not. It was obviously a staffer on the Michigan staff, and I don't know who it was. Possibly was that younger kid that brought it up to Chris Partridge, but at the end of the day, it was within the Michigan program. It was not outside of it. It was not Ryan Day doing some sting operation against Michigan. It was someone within that program that had seen the wrongdoing happen and say, got to stand up, got to do something, and that's kind of how it unfolded. So that can kind of be put to bed. Overall, doesn't necessarily do too much for us in terms of trying to figure out, relitigate this thing and figure out, how much wrongdoing there was. It does show that a lot of this, I don't want to say bending of the truth, but a lot of the narrative pushing that was out there right afterwards was in a lot of ways to save Michigan's face. And I totally understand that. That's the reality of just about anyone that's under investigation by the NCAA. But it has been confirmed that it came from within the Michigan program and probably was just a lower level staffer that had knowledge of all this stuff going on and said, at a certain point, you got to stand up and do something. So that is another big piece of this, something that doesn't necessarily change the story too much, if I'm being totally honest, but does kind of change the way that some Michigan fans and some people around that were kind of pointing it towards the Ohio State side. That is not what happened here. It came from the Michigan side, and then you just had to figure out what was going to happen after that. The biggest piece of this, and the one that has stolen a ton of headlines, has been Sherrone Moore's text, and the excuse that he has for deleting a lot of the text for Connor Stalions. To catch everyone up, there was a lot of, I believe it was 57 deleted texts between Sherrone Moore and Connor Stalions. It was a lot of assorted number of things. There were a couple of different things that were fairly incriminating, and we'll talk about that in a second, but a lot of the different things to talk about was the coach, Sherrone Moore, told school officials that he deleted the messages in frustration and anger. Shortly after the bombshell news broke, he's saying that he suggested he did not want one person, Connor Stalions, to receive credit for all the work that they did to get to the national championship. He said he was just so angry at someone that would do that type of thing to the program and to the kids. Here's the thing. I totally understand that there are certain things that would have happened behind closed doors that I don't fully understand, that there are certain things that I don't know the full story of. The reality is, if you're in a position where you have incriminating text for someone else, which he did, he had certain text about the CMU-SMU game that was very famous because Connor Stalions was photographed on the sideline. He had scheduled a meeting with someone named Jack Costner from CMU before that game unfolded. So I don't know what that means. I don't know what was discussed in that meeting, but I know for a fact the CMU staffer doesn't need to be meeting with Sherrone Moore before they play Michigan State. I can say that very, very confidently. So the text between Sherrone Moore and Stalions definitely raised some questions, and I think there's a lot of different ones that really do incriminate him in a lot of different ways. What I will say is I do think there's certain things that you don't really know all the details around these different things, and the other part of this is if he was angry, if he was super angry about what Connor Stalions was doing, and he really wanted to make sure that that guy did not get the credit for what Michigan was doing, why not bring it to someone? I understand that there would have been certain penalties that Michigan would have had to incur because of this, regardless of who brought it to someone, regardless of what happened. But if he felt that the nature of their program and the nature of the game that they play was being compromised by someone that was not all that important to the program, that was not this big name, that didn't deserve to have his name in that type of realm, why not say something to someone? Why not get him fired immediately? Why not kick him out the door and continue moving on about your business? Because the reality is you could have helped out this process a lot while saving yourself in a number of different ways. So it's not to say that Sherrone Moore made absolutely the wrong decision. It's just to say if you were really that mad, if you were really that upset about what Connor Stalions was doing, why not be the guy that helped kind of take him down, help kick him out of the sport, help be the guy that kind of removed him from Michigan football instead of what he is right now, which is essentially kind of a cult hero around there. So I don't fully buy that, if I'm being totally honest. I don't necessarily think Sherrone Moore is outright lying, but I think there are certain things about that just don't make sense to me. I think the reality is if I was that upset about someone really defacing the Michigan program and putting their season in a really bad spot and possibly making their season go up in flames, I'd be really mad, and I'd be trying to get that guy out of the sport as quickly as possible, and Sherrone Moore went pretty quiet pretty quickly. So the texts are a very interesting thing. It's obviously something that will continue to be talked about, and we'll probably get a little bit more details about what all was in there, but there were definitely some things in there that incriminate Sherrone Moore, and he deleted them pretty quickly. That's what I know for a fact. Whether or not it was because he was angry or because he was trying to save himself a little bit, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's a very confusing situation and one that absolutely calls into a lot of questions. But what's really happening here? There's a lot of different ways to look at this and a lot of different things to a lot of different lenses to go at this from. The reality of this situation is, from what I've read of the 137 pages that Michigan released, it did not help them. It did not make them look better. It did not make me feel better about what they did this past season. Now, I've said time and again that I do think it played a part in what they were able to do in the path to a national title. I don't think it won them the national title. I think that's very, very clear at this point. If you believe it won them the national title, then that's a totally different conversation that can be had another day. But the reality is, in those 137 pages, I don't think anyone came out of it saying, oh, okay, Michigan's totally off scot-free, it makes total sense what they're doing, and all of those should be dropped to a level 2 violation. What I think is happening, and it is not necessarily exactly what is happening, but what I think is happening and what it seems to be happening, at least from an outside point of view, the NCAA is weak. The NCAA doesn't mean anything to a Michigan, to a Texas, to a Alabama, to a Georgia. They do not necessarily hold any power over these programs anymore. So they can try as best as they might. If they, punish them for certain things, Michigan will come right back at them and they'll throw some lawsuit at them. If they want to, go after them for something totally different, Michigan will make sure they have something ready for that. The reality of the situation is, regardless of what Michigan did, regardless of if the 137 pages made them look better or worse, in my opinion, it made them look a little bit worse than it did before. I don't think it matters. I think they understand they're dealing with an entity that has no power over them, that has no power to say, these are the rules and we're going to enforce these rules. You don't have rules. You don't have a structure to work from right now. So if you're Michigan, you see a wounded lion. You see a wounded gazelle, and you're the lion, actually. But you see a wounded gazelle and you're saying, I'm going to tear it to pieces. That's the reality of this situation. If no one in the sport, if no school in the sport actually cares about what the NCAA does or is actually scared of the NCAA, they're going to keep pushing them until they crumble. And we've seen time and again in these cases that the NCAA will crumble. So overall, my take about this is this story did not make me feel better about the Michigan scheme. It didn't make me feel like they did a ton of things that were different. It didn't make me feel like Connor Stalions wasn't a terrible part of what they did last year. It didn't make me feel any differently. It actually made me feel a little bit worse about some of the things that they did. I don't think they care. I think they know for a fact that the NCAA, if they push hard enough, is going to fold at some point because they folded time and again. So I think the reality of the situation is the NCAA just has to go. That's the reality of all of these situations where you see schools and teams and players just kind of take the NCAA to the woodshed over and over and over again. And Michigan said, they were sitting there thinking about what their next steps were, and they were saying, why don't we just fight this thing? Why don't we just fight the entity that continues to get beat in a court of law, continues to get beat when they try to enforce their rules, and just dare them to enforce them? Because they're probably not going to be able to. So overall, I don't think I walked out of that thing thinking, okay, Michigan's totally exonerated in my mind. I definitely didn't think that. There are a lot of different things in there that I didn't necessarily know, at least on no uncertain terms, that make me feel a little bit worse about what Michigan did last year. I just don't think it matters. I think they understand that they're working with an entity that has no power, that has no teeth, and they can kind of push around as they please. So I think they're going to probably find a way to get a couple of those violations dropped a little bit. Now, there is the other side of it where it could go wrong for them, but the reality is, how many times in the last 5 years have things really gone wrong for people when they're battling the NCAA? It just doesn't happen anymore because the NCAA doesn't have any power anymore. So that's the big thing here, is we got to find someone else to run this sport. We got to find someone else that these teams will be afraid of. These teams will actually believe will actually do something to them, because Michigan definitely doesn't believe that the NCAA is going to do anything concrete to them. So that's something we can talk about in time, definitely something that will come out in more detail. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about the next head coach to win a national title. Let's take a little bit of a break from the NCAA talk. Let's get into the next coach to possibly join Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, and Dabo Swinney as the only active head coaches with a national title, and we'll talk about why it might take a little bit longer for some of these guys right after this, so stick with us.